Well, I've been kind of busy this week with work. Don't have a lot of time or headspace to be making new videos, but I can always get a little bit of inspiration from Frank Turek. So in this video, I am going to take a look briefly at a tweet from Frank Turek and then offer some critical response to it. So Turek posted, if the God who created you and sacrificed himself for you wanted you to refrain from certain sexual behaviors, would you obey him? Probably there are several people reading this right now who would say, no, your God isn't Jesus. It's your own personal sexual gratification. I've seen Turek make similar comments on several occasions where he will talk about how people really just want to have, fulfill their sexual gratification, so they refuse to follow the clear teaching of Jesus. Now, the subtext here is the people that Turek is, I suspect, talking about are groups like youth who have sex outside of marriage and same-sex attracted people who are in monogamous same-sex relationships. Those are like some of the people that Turek is targeting here. I suspect one group that he's not targeting are, let's say, evangelical Christians who have been divorced and remarried for a reason other than sexual immorality or like adultery. Even though when Jesus talks, let's say in the Gospel of Matthew about divorce, he says that if you divorce for any reason other than porneia or you know, marital unfaithfulness and then remarry, you are in adultery. That's what Jesus said in his teaching, which would follow that. We'll keep this in mind that divorce rates among evangelicals are equivalent to, if not higher than, the general population. And that means that there are a lot, probably millions of evangelicals in America who are divorced and remarried for reasons other than porneia. In other words, the marital unfaithfulness of the other spouse. And does Frank believe that those people are saying no to the standards of Jesus? Does he teach and tell these people, you are now in an illegitimate adulterous relationship in your quote unquote second marriage because you divorced for a reason other than porneia? I never hear from evangelical leaders like Frank Turek a clear condemnation of people who are divorced and remarried because they are breaching the clear teaching of Jesus as it is present in the Gospel of Matthew 19. I never hear that. I always hear them talk about gay people, well, mostly gay people, maybe trans people, and kids, having sex outside of marriage. So that's interesting because that suggests to me that there is a deep inconsistency here in how they are applying the teaching of Jesus. That he is confident, Frank is confident to say all these other people have a false Jesus, worship a false Jesus. But he won't say the same thing about evangelicals who are divorced and remarried. And that's just interesting. But here's another thing that's even more interesting. Let's just read the tweet again. If the God who created you and sacrificed himself for you wanted you to refrain from certain sexual behaviors, would you obey him? Probably there are several people reading this right now who would say no. And here's the thing I would want to say, and I think, again, this is maybe even more important, thing that I'd want to say to Frank Turek. How about this as a question or an observation? If the God who created you and sacrificed himself for you wanted you to embrace and love your immigrant and refugee neighbor, would you obey him? Probably there are several people reading this right now who would say no. If the God who created you and sacrificed himself for you wanted you to give up your guns and embrace peace, would you obey him? Probably there are several people reading this right now who would say no. If the God who created you and sacrificed himself for you wanted you to repudiate the grotesque immoral behavior of your political leader? Would you obey him? Probably there are several people reading this right now who would say no. In other words, on number of issues, the very tweet that Frank Turek used as a cudgel to condemn people from certain outgroups could be readily turned back as a prophetic witness by simply being reworded and refocused to identify the very serious idolatry within the conservative evangelical Christian community. On so many topics, evangelical Christians can be accused of the exact same thing that Frank Turek is condemning in others. There's, of course, endless examples of critics pointing out how evangelicals have conformed Jesus to their image. The interesting thing about this political cartoon here is this predates the Donald Trump era, but of course, there have been many since then. Is it true that I should give everything I have to the poor? That's ridiculous. If they don't want to be poor, they should just get a job like everybody else. Republican Jesus. Republican Jesus. No loaves and fishes for the poor unless they get a job, etc. Open up. It's Jesus. You better not have any minorities in there. And this is one of my favorites. What would Republican Jesus do? Cut food stamp benefits, gut affordable health care, demonize the homeless, block equality rights. So it is true that people can adopt a false idol of who Jesus is because of desire to live out their own sexual lives in a way inconsistent with a Judeo-Christian ethic. But that's not probably the main thing when it comes to what evangelicals need to hear. What they need to hear is all the ways that they are often creating an idol, a false Jesus, recreating Jesus in their image. And it's on that point that the voice of Frank Turek is anything but prophetic. There is a complete lack of awareness in his teaching over the degree to which he himself and this large constituency of American evangelicals have effectively created Jesus in their own image. This, of course, is not anything new. This is the constant problem for every human being, and certainly every professing disciple of Jesus, is that they would end up creating Jesus in their own image. Albert Schweitzer famously concluded his survey of 19th century Christologies by describing the Christologians who had produced them as being like an individual looking down a very deep well, attempting to access the Jesus of history through their critical scholarship, seeing a shimmering image at the bottom of the well, thinking that that's Jesus, when in fact it was simply their own image reflected back to them. And that's a danger for all of us. But it's also definitely a danger for Frank Turek and the conservative evangelicals who have so often conformed Jesus to their image, the image of a red cap, the image of intolerance toward refugees, toward immigrants, toward people living on the margins, devaluation for socioeconomic justice in the embrace of a true gospel of peace.